Abutted seam. The fabric of the garment is the criterion for the selection of seams. For leather or felted materials which do not have the limitation of unraveling, abutted seam is very apt. Unlike other seams where the fabric pieces are placed one on top of the other for stitching, in abutted seam the two edges of the fabric pieces are placed next to each other and sewn with a zigzag stitch. And it is this abutted seam that we are going to learn in this class. Objectives. At the end of this class, you will be able to identify an abutted seam, sew an abutted seam. What is an abutted seam? This is what the abutted seam looks like. An abutted seam is used to join felted material or leather. This seam doesn't need seam allowance. Let's see how to do the abutted seam on a sample. Procedure of sewing the abutted seam. You will need the following items to do this sample: fake leather, another thin fabric, straight ruler, tailor square, straight pins, measuring tape, tailor's chalk, shears, a pair of small scissors, contrasting thread, iron, sewing machine. Now let's begin. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. At the outset, take 2 layers of fake leather. Measure and draw 10-inch by 10-inch square on it with the help of a tailor's square, measuring tape, and a tailor's chalk. Using the shears, cut the marked squares. Step 2. Position the fabric pieces edge to edge for sewing. Place the cut fabric pieces edge to edge next to one another. Step 3. Change the sewing machine functions. Now we will start stitching, but before we stitch, change the following functions. With the help of the stitch length regulator, change the normal stitch to shorter stitch. Change the stitch pattern from straight to zigzag with the help of the stitch pattern selector lever. Also change the number from 5, which is a straight stitch, to 6, which is a zigzag stitch, on the stitch pattern selector dial. Step 4. Stitch the seam. Thus, using a zigzag stitch, join them together on the right side of the leather. When you are done, snip the thread with a pair of small scissors. Finally, you have your sample with the abutted seam ready. Please note, here we are using a contrasting thread for demonstration purposes only, so that it is visible, but otherwise one would use a thread matching to the fabric. Another way of doing the abutted seam is to keep a straight strip or bi-strip of a thin fabric under the 2 touching edges and stitch with a straight normal stitch close to the joint on the right side of the leather. The thin fabric strip will hold the 2 pieces together but will not add bulkiness to the seam. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned in this class. An abutted seam is used to join felted material or leather. This seam doesn't need seam allowance. The procedure of sewing the abutted seam. Let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. Step 2. Place the cut fabric pieces edge to edge next to one another. Step 3. Change the sewing machine functions. Step 4. Stitch the seam. This is the abutted seam. So now you have learned all about the abutted seam. Take our next class to learn about the lapped seam.